The Texas sun spilled gold over the Mason Ranch, painting the endless fields in fire and shadow. Every morning, the wind sang through the fences, and the sound of horses echoed like a heartbeat through the land. Inside the sprawling house on the hill, silence ruled, except for the faint shuffle of feet, belonging to one quiet soul who moved as though she didn't belong there. Her name was Clara, the new maid. She was 24, soft-spoken, and never looked anyone straight in the eye unless spoken to. Her hands were rough from scrubbing floors and her spirit was humble. But behind her quiet eyes was a history she never spoke of. And then there was Caleb Mason, the richest rancher for miles, a man whose name was known from Amarillo to Abilene. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes sharp as steel and a reputation colder than winter. He'd built his empire with his own hands and carried a kind of pride that didn't bend easily. To most people, Caleb was a man to be feared or admired, never understood. But lately, something about Clara's presence had unsettled that hard shell around his heart. He noticed how she flinched whenever he entered a room. How she worked twice as hard when anyone was watching. How, when she thought she was alone, she hummed old gospel songs that filled the house with something the mansion hadn't known in years, peace. Caleb didn't know why he cared, but he did. So one evening, after a long day of business meetings and barn repairs, he decided to test what kind of person Clara really was. He pretended to fall asleep on the couch in the grand room. Hat tilted over his face, boots still on, firelight flickering across his coat. He wanted to see if she'd take advantage, if her kindness was real, or just a show for the men who signed her paychecks. Clara entered quietly, carrying a bucket and cloth. She froze when she saw him sleeping there. Her heart stuttered, her hands trembling slightly. She could have turned back, but instead, she whispered, "Lord, give me strength," and began to clean around him. Every move was gentle, careful, respectful. She didn't touch his things, didn't pry, didn't even breathe too loud. But then, as she bent to pick up the fallen book near his boot, something happened that made Caleb's heart stop. She brushed the dust off the book's cover, his late mother's Bible, and instead of setting it aside, she placed it softly on the table, opened it, and whispered, "You raised a good man, ma'am." He just forgot how to smile. Caleb's eyes stayed closed, but his throat tightened. No one had spoken about his mother in years. Not like that. Clara sat back on her knees, looking at him with quiet sadness. "You pretend to be asleep, sir," she whispered under her breath, not knowing he heard. "But your soul hasn't rested in a long time." Then she did something that made him freeze. Completely, she knelt by the fire, folded her hands, and prayed softly for him. Not for money, not for mercy, but for peace. Caleb didn't move. Couldn't. His test had turned into something else, a mirror he wasn't ready to face. When she finished, Clara stood, placed his hat gently on the armrest, and left the room without a sound. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Caleb alone with the fire and his thoughts. He slowly opened his eyes, staring into the flames. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. He realized he'd just witnessed more honesty in 5 quiet minutes than he'd seen from any person in his entire life. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep, not because he was restless, but because for the first time, he saw the truth. The shy maid he thought was beneath him had more grace than anyone he'd ever met. And deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. He whispered to the empty room, "Maybe I'm the one being tested." The next morning, the sun rose over Mason Ranch like a slow promise. The horses stirred in their stables. Wind whispered through the oaks. And the world looked just as it had the day before, except for one man. Caleb Mason woke up before dawn, staring at the ceiling with the same thought circling in his mind, her words. "You pretend to be asleep, sir, but your soul hasn't rested in a long time." No one had ever spoken to him that way, not even when they thought he couldn't hear. It wasn't accusation or pity. It was truth wrapped in gentleness. Something he didn't know he'd needed. He got up, pulled on his boots, and walked to the big window that overlooked the ranch. For years, he'd looked out and seen only numbers, acres, cattle, profits. But today, he saw something else, people working. Laughing faintly. The ranch alive with small pieces of humanity he'd forgotten how to notice. And somewhere down there, near the wash line, he saw her. Clara, in her plain gray dress, hanging linens that danced in the morning wind. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her eyes focused on her work. Her movements slow but steady. She didn't know he was watching, and that somehow made it harder for him to look away. He didn't understand what was happening to him. Caleb Mason, who'd built fences around his land and his heart, now couldn't stop thinking about the maid who prayed for him when no one was watching. That evening, he did something he hadn't done in years. He ate in the kitchen. Not the dining hall. When Clara walked in and nearly dropped the tray she was carrying, he almost smiled. "Easy," he said softly. "Didn't mean to scare you." Her voice trembled. I didn't expect you here, sir. I'll take this to the main table." He shook his head. "No. I'll eat here tonight." She froze, unsure if it was a trick or kindness. Caleb sat down at the small wooden table by the stove, the one the workers used. He picked up a plate, noticed how neatly she'd arranged the food, and nodded toward the other chair. "Sit," he said. Her eyes widened. "Sir, I can't." "I'm not asking you to break rules," he interrupted gently. "I'm saying you've earned a moment to breathe." Slowly, carefully, Clara sat. For the first time, they shared silence that didn't feel heavy. He asked simple things: where she was from, how long she'd worked on ranches. Her answers were short but honest. She'd grown up in Georgia, moved west for work, and had no family left. "The Lord's my only kin," she said quietly, eyes on her plate. Something about the way she said it broke something inside him. After that night, Caleb began to see things differently. He noticed the cracks in the barn roof and fixed them himself. He began paying the workers extra for overtime. He even stopped shouting orders from his porch. Instead, he worked beside them. And Clara? She kept her head down as always. But people started whispering that the boss wasn't the same anymore. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, fierce, sudden, and merciless. The ranch hands scrambled to bring the horses in. But lightning struck one of the outer barns before they could reach it. Fire burst out like a beast roaring through the wind. "Get the water barrels," Caleb shouted, running straight into the smoke. Rain hammered down, wind howled, but the fire fought to stay alive. And then, through the haze, he saw her again, Clara, dragging a small foal out of the burning barn. Coughing, struggling, refusing to let go. "Clara!" he roared, grabbing her arm. She stumbled, nearly collapsing, but he caught her just in time. Together, they pulled the last horse out. And then the roof gave way behind them with a deafening crash. For a moment, there was only rain and breathing, his heavy, hers trembling. He looked at her, soot streaking her cheeks, eyes wide but alive. "You could have died in there," he said hoarsely. Her reply was soft, but steady. "So could you, sir." He wanted to scold her. Instead, he found himself laughing, the sound foreign, rusty, real. "You're a fool," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "Takes one to know one." That night, the fire was out. The storm passed, and the ranch stood quiet again. But something inside Caleb had changed forever. He sat alone in the same room where he'd pretended to sleep, staring at the faint reflection of the flames. Only this time, he wasn't testing anyone. He was remembering the woman who had risked her life to save what he loved most. He leaned back, whispering to himself. "She prayed for me when I was asleep. And when I woke up, she saved me." And for the first time in 10 long years, Caleb Mason smiled. Outside, Clara walked past the porch, her lamp flickering in the wind. She didn't know he was watching, and he didn't call out. But in his heart, he made a promise that somehow he'd find a way to thank her for teaching him what real strength looked like. Little did either of them know, their story was just beginning.